introducing grassroots initiatives that are going to help the people. And so they use that as a way to go into the most remote parts of Africa. They're talking about government advocacy. When you look at it on paper, it all looks really good, but they're actually wolf in sheep's clothing. They are using that open access sounding humanitarian to constantly destabilize governments. I can tell you right now, the majority of African leaders are happy USAID is leaving Hungary because they are always supporting opposition. Their form of government advocacy is supporting whoever can keep the government in a turmoil.
Look at something pretty interesting, I think. You know, we've been seeing these big cuts to US aid to Africa lately.
Yeah.
And I think there are some really interesting perspectives on what that means and what might come next.
Yeah.
One of the most, how do I say, I guess you could say provocative voices in this whole discussion is Ambassador Arikana Chihombori-Quao.
Right.
And you know, what's really interesting is we're going to be looking at a conversation she had with Steve Clemons.
Mm-hmm.
And this was around the time the Trump administration was really starting to scale back aid to a number of African countries.
Right. Yeah. And we're talking billions of dollars less going to places like the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Yeah.
Ethiopia, Sudan, also Nigeria, South Sudan, Kenya, Mozambique, Uganda.
Right.
This is not a small change.
No. Not at all. You can't just like kind of brush that aside. This is a major shift in U.S. policy, and of course, it's going to have huge implications for the countries involved.
What I think is so fascinating about Ambassador Chihombori-Quao's perspective on all this is that she really flips the script, you know? Like, I think a lot of people, when they hear about these aid cuts, they immediately jump to like, oh my gosh, this is terrible for the people who rely on that assistance. Mm-hmm. And while that's certainly a valid concern, what she's saying is, hold on a second. Maybe this is a chance for Africa to kind of step back, reevaluate, and really start charting its own course.
Yeah.
So what we want to do today is really unpack her reasoning. You know, like, why does she see it this way? What are the specific arguments she's putting forward?
Yeah, and I think the thing that's at the heart of a lot of what she's saying is that U.S. aid, you know, maybe it's not as altruistic as it's often presented, right? Yeah. Maybe it's had a much more complicated impact, potentially even a damaging effect.
Yeah.
And the way she really frames this right from the start is with this really vivid analogy. Mm-hmm. She describes USAID and some Western NGOs as wolf in sheep's clothing.
Very strong image, right?
Yeah. So let's dig into that a little bit. Like, when she says that, what are the key elements of her argument?
Well, you know, I think the core of what she's saying is that these organizations, despite presenting this humanitarian front, they actually have a totally different agenda.
Yeah.
And that agenda really boils down to political interference and the exploitation of resources.
Okay.
She says, and I'm quoting here, their sole purpose was to act as if they're coming to rescue Africa, but they're actually wolf in sheep's clothing. They are using that open access sounding humanitarian to constantly destabilize government. Mm-hmm. So right there, she's accusing them of using aid as a cover for something far more sinister.
Right. And she doesn't just make these kind of general accusations. She actually gets really specific, right?
Yeah, she does.
She talks about how these groups actively support opposition movements. Mm-hmm. They engage in what she calls government advocacy, which she seems to be implying is all about deliberately weakening these nations.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's a pretty serious accusation. It's like saying they're actively trying to undermine the stability of these countries.
Yeah, and you know, I think this is where it gets really interesting, because she even suggests that many African leaders are actually privately happy to see USAID scaling back. Mm-hmm. She even mentions a Hungarian government official who voiced a very similar concern about what they saw as U.S. aid meddling in their country's affairs.
Right.
And, you know, makes you think, like for a lot of people in the U.S., foreign aid is this really simple idea. It's about helping people who are in desperate need.
Yeah.
It's about combating disease, fostering development.
Yeah, you see those commercials on TV, right, with the sad music and the kids who need help, and it's all very, it tugs at your heartstrings.
Right.
But Ambassador Chihombori-Quao is presenting a totally different narrative.
Yeah.
She's painting it as a major meddling agenda. She even hints that some aid workers might be like operatives underground.
That's a very different picture.
It is. It's a much more cynical view, but you have to consider where she's coming from.
Yeah.
And her skepticism doesn't just stop at questioning their motives, right? She also directly challenges whether this aid has actually been effective.
Yeah.
Like, has it actually achieved what it's supposed to do? And what really stands out to me is this very pointed question she asks.
Yeah.
She says, show me one country that USAID was in and education improved. Show me what country where USAID was in and healthcare improved. The social services they bringing is peanuts. It's a real challenge. Like, show me the results.
Right. She's basically saying, look at the evidence.
Yeah.
Where is the real improvement in these fundamental areas like education and healthcare? Where's the justification for all this money that's been spent and the influence that's been exerted?
Exactly. And she goes further. She says that only a tiny fraction of the billions of dollars in aid actually reaches the people who are supposed to benefit from it.
Right. So then you have to wonder, where's the rest of that money going?
Yeah.
What's its real impact?
It's a good question, right? Like, is it being absorbed by administrative overhead?
Yeah.
Are the NGOs themselves taking a huge cut? Or is it actually being funneled towards these political agendas that she's talking about?
Yeah. I mean, it really kind of opens up this whole Pandora's box of questions.
It does.
And it's interesting because she also goes on to talk about specific aid programs.
Yeah.
Again, her perspective is pretty critical, even of initiatives that are generally seen as really positive.
Yeah.
Like PEPFAR, for example, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. I mean, that's had huge bipartisan support in the U.S.
Yeah.
It's credited with saving literally millions of lives.
Right, absolutely. I mean, PEPFAR has been widely praised as a major success story in the fight against HIV/AIDS.
Right, and yet here you have Ambassador Chihombori-Quao expressing really serious reservations about it.
Yeah, and she makes some pretty strong allegations. She even references this alleged program in South Africa involving virus injection. She uses some really strong language.
Yeah.
She talks about Africans being used as guinea pigs for experimental activities.
Right.
It's clear that she has a deep mistrust of the motivations behind even these seemingly beneficial programs. And I think it's important to remember that these are her assertions, and they're coming from a place of having seen a history of exploitation.
Yeah.
This feeling that African people haven't always been treated with the respect they deserve.
Right, and that historical context seems to really inform how she views all of this.
It does, absolutely. It's like a lens through which she's seeing the world. And you can see that same lens when she talks about agricultural aid, specifically the introduction of GMOs.
Okay, so what's her take on GMOs?
Well, she's very critical of them.
Okay.
She argues that introducing GMOs through agencies like USA is actually destroying African agriculture.
Okay, how so?
Well, her reasoning is that these engineered seeds, they can't be reused in the next planting season. And that's a huge problem because traditional African farming practices have always relied on saving seeds and replanting them year after year.
Right.
So she sees this as a clash between Western agricultural models and indigenous knowledge and sustainable practices.
Yeah.
And, it's not just about the seeds themselves. It's about control. It's about who has the power over food production.
Right.
And she's saying that this push for GMOs is taking that control away from African farmers.
Okay, so against this backdrop of these very critical views on USAID, she then kind of shifts gears a little bit. And she starts talking about what she sees as a potential silver lining to all of this.
Right.
And that is the opportunity for genuine self-determination.
Yeah, an Africa First approach, which is interesting, right?
Yeah, it's very much echoing the America First rhetoric we've heard elsewhere.
It is. And she frames this moment not as a crisis or a setback, but as an opportunity, a silver lining, a wake-up call for African leaders. She fundamentally believes that Africa has everything it needs in terms of resources and potential. And the real problem isn't a lack of aid. It's the exploitation of its resources by external powers.
Right.
She says, and I'm quoting again, what we need is for those who are exploiting Africa to stop. It's a powerful statement.
It is. And,
Yeah.
and she actually gives this really striking example to illustrate this point.
Yeah. The case of Niger and its uranium mining.
Yeah, can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So she describes how French companies were paying Niger a really low price for their uranium,
Okay.
like 80 cents per kilo.
Wow.
And then they were turning around and selling it on the international market for 200 euros per kilo.
Oh my gosh, it's a huge markup.
It is. It's a staggering difference. And when Niger decided to take control of its own uranium resources, guess what happened?
What happened?
Their revenue went through the roof.
Wow.
It jumped from about $1 billion to over $300 billion a year.
That is incredible.
It is. And for her, this is a perfect example of what resource sovereignty can do. It's showing that the economic benefits can be way bigger than any amount of aid money.
Right.
Of course, managing that kind of massive increase in revenue also comes with its own challenges.
Yeah, you're not wrong about that.
But still, it's a really powerful illustration of her point.
Yeah, it really underscores this idea that the true wealth lies within Africa itself.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of gaining control and benefiting from it directly.
Right. And this leads to a really interesting discussion about the role of other international players.
Yeah, like China.
Exactly. China has been really ramping up its engagement with Africa in recent years.
Yeah, and Steve Clemons actually brings up this common narrative of China maybe beating the U.S. in Africa, especially in things like building infrastructure and securing these resource deals.
Right. And Ambassador Chihombori-Quao acknowledges China's growing presence.
Yeah.
But she's really adamant about African nations having a unified African position when they negotiate with any global power.
Right.
Not just China, any global power.
Right. Yeah, so what's she worried about when it comes to China?
Well, she's worried that without this unity, African nations risk becoming dependent on a new set of external actors.
Right.
She puts it pretty bluntly. She says, China wants to come and exploit Africa. They'll get away with it to the extent that the Africans will allow them.
So it's this same concern about exploitation just with a different player.
Exactly. And for her, the solution is African agency.
Yeah.
It's about having a strong collective voice. She keeps emphasizing this need for Africa to unite and to speak with one voice on the global stage.
Right, because without that unified front, individual nations are just more vulnerable to being taken advantage of in these bilateral negotiations.
Exactly. It's about strength in numbers.
Yeah, and this whole issue of unity or the challenges to achieving it, it kind of brings us to her thoughts on the legacy of colonialism and how she thinks that continues to shape the mindsets of some African leaders. She seems to believe that this historical context plays a really big role in the current dynamics.
Absolutely. She argues that the long history of colonialism and slavery has created a psychological barrier to genuine unity and self-reliance.
Okay.
And she talks about this belief that exists among some African leaders that you can't make it unless you're working with white people.
Which obviously perpetuates this cycle of dependency.
It does. It reinforces this idea that Africa needs outside help to succeed.
Yeah, and she describes it as a battle of the mind.
Yeah.
This need for Africans to overcome what she sees as a brainwashed mentality.
Right. To break free from this feeling of dependency and have faith in their own abilities.
And she thinks that that's absolutely crucial for moving forward.
It's central to her whole analysis. She believes that until Africans truly believe in their own worth and potential, they'll always be vulnerable to external influence.
Right. No matter who the global power is.
Exactly. It's about internal strength and self-belief.
Finally, they touch on the role of these big international institutions like the UN, the World Bank, the IMF.
Yeah.
And Ambassador Chihombori-Quao's perspective on these is also pretty unconventional.
It is. It's very much outside the mainstream view. She agrees with this observation that things are shifting towards this model of strong men and deals.
Right.
Which maybe makes these big institutions less important. But her critique goes deeper than that.
Okay.
She sees these institutions as inherently biased.
Okay.
She says they were created after World War II to help Europe recover,
Right.
not to benefit the developing world.
And she doesn't hold back.
No, she doesn't. She says they were built to steal from the developing world.
Wow.
And, to be fair, the impact of these institutions on developing nations has been debated for a long time.
Yeah, there are definitely different perspectives on that.
Right. But her view is very clear.
And based on that view, she actually supports the U.S. withdrawing from some of these organizations.
Yeah, like the UN and the WHO.
She even suggests leaving the WTO. arguing that these bodies haven't really addressed the exploitation and the unequal trade policies that harm Africa.
Right. And she uses the example of cocoa production to illustrate this.
Yeah, can you explain that a bit?
Sure. So West African nations, they're the main producers of cocoa beans, but historically they haven't been able to add much value to those raw materials, through processing or manufacturing.
Right.
And she's implying that these international institutions have done very little to change that.
So it's kept African nations stuck in this position of just exporting raw commodities.
Exactly, which feeds into her broader argument that the whole system is rigged against developing nations.
Yeah, and thinking about value chains and these historical trade agreements, it really does provide some context to this.
It does. It helps you understand the complexities of the situation.
Yeah, so if we try to distill Ambassador Chihombori-Quao's key arguments, it seems like it comes down to this.
Okay.
USAID, despite what we often hear about its humanitarian intentions, it's often been used as a tool for political interference and economic exploitation.
Yeah.
Which has actually hindered Africa's progress and its ability to be self-reliant.
Right. And she sees these aid cuts as a potential turning point.
Yeah.
Not a disaster, but a chance for African nations to embrace self-determination, take control of their resources, and really forge their own path.
In this new global landscape that we're all a part of.
Exactly. It's a very different way of looking at things.
Yeah, and it really challenges a lot of the assumptions that we have in the West about the nature of aid and its impact.
It does. And she's very passionate about this idea of an Africa First mindset.
Yeah.
She wants to see more unity among African nations and a more equitable relationship with the rest of the world.
And I think, regardless of where you stand on these issues, I think her perspective raises some really profound questions for us.
Yeah, like what are the long-term consequences of viewing things through this lens of exploitation?
Right.
And how does the history of colonialism continue to affect the relationships between countries today?
In ways that we might not even realize.
Right. And those are crucial questions to consider.
Yeah, because understanding that historical context is so essential for really grasping the complexities of these relationships.
It is. It helps us see the world from different perspectives.
And that's where we're all about here.
Absolutely. Encouraging critical thinking and open-mindedness.
So we really encourage you, our listeners, to dig into these issues.
Yeah, do your own research.
Seek out different perspectives and really try to understand these complex global dynamics.
Because the world is a complicated place and there's always more to learn.
And that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us for this crucial conversation.
Yeah, this is a good one.
If you found it thought-provoking,
which I hope you did,
please like this video.
Yeah.
Share your thoughts in the comments below.
Let us know what you think.
And be sure to subscribe for more in-depth analyses of critical global topics.
Because we've got a lot more to talk about.
We do.
Thanks again for listening.
See you next time.